When did environmentalism become a pretentious idea? Well, it at least in some part comes from a debate over what to do with the spotted owl in Oregon, pitting working class timber workers with environmentalists, causing some of the divide we see today. With that in mind, let's allow Associate Professor of History Steven Beda tell us more.
And where in Alaska? I know you said you're located in Alaska. Where at?
I'm in Anchorage.
Okay.
I'm in Anchorage. I'm originally from Idaho, which is a
Okay.
little town called Twin Falls. It's a little pass-through town.
Oh yeah. No. I mean, I've seen it on maps. I might have driven through there.
Yeah, Evil Knievel once tried to jump our canyon, so
Yeah. No, okay. That's probably why I know. Yeah. No. A couple years ago, I was up in Southeast Alaska, and then this summer I'll be up near Prudhoe Bay, caribou hunting. So,
oh, very cool,
yeah,
very cool.
really looking
Yeah,
forward to it.
lot of cool stuff going on up there in the interior.
Yeah.
Until all the wilderness lands are sold and given.
Well, that's what I figured. I gotta go see the caribou and hunt them now while they still exist. But
Well, yeah, and that is a great intro to our topic. I am joined by Steven Beda, a associate professor of history over at the University of Oregon. Thank you for being here with me this afternoon. How's the weather down there in Oregon right now?
It is surprisingly sunny. This is the time of year when we go from nice. The big secret of the Pacific Northwest is our summers are actually gorgeous. Everyone thinks rain, but our summers are 70s and sunny. We have wildfire smoke, but can't have all good. But yeah, right around now is when the time turns. So this is probably one of the last sunny, warm days we'll experience for a couple months.
Yeah, I'm up here in Alaska, and it's been that kind of like in between section of wildfires and snow, so it's been mostly rain, which is really nice.
Yeah,
That little time frame where it's not smoky, but it's not freezing. Like
right.
that's pretty peak. That we love that over here in the West Coast. One thing that I think the West Coast has is some amazing like national parks and that stuff. So originally from Idaho, we've got a lot of cool national monuments, national parks. You guys have some cool stuff over there in Oregon?
Oh, it's an amazing place. So we have one national park, Crater Lake National Park, but we have multiple wilderness areas. The United States Forest Service is essentially the biggest landowner in Oregon, so we have a lot of just amazing forests. When people think Oregon, they think rain and forest, and that is part of the state. But then the other half of the state is high mountain desert, which has its own beauty, its own dry, arid river canyons to explore. It's just an amazing place if you like outdoors, or you like nature, or you're interested in the natural world. It's hard to beat Oregon.
Yeah, especially that like eastern portion of the state where it starts turning into Idaho. That area,
Right.
there's a lot of like really cool high deserty. There's like I guess is biome the right word? Like a little biome that's like kind of these nice rocky canyons.
Yeah, you got rocky canyons, and then you also got pine forests. You got, even though it's dry and arid, you got the Columbia River Plateau, which have waterfalls and stuff like that. So it's this remarkable juxtaposition between like waterfalls and dry desert, or you know I've been on hikes or bike rides or something like that where you start off in like the driest desert and you just climb up a mountain, and all of a sudden you're in this beautiful pine forest. So it's an amazing juxtaposition, right? You got these little pockets of biomes, like you say.
Yeah, over the summer we had a group from Texas ride their bikes from Texas all the way to Anchorage, which was an
Wow.
impressive feat. But I feel like a lot of this really cool stuff and stuff that you do out in the wilderness can't be done without some level of environmental conservation, which
Indeed.
is kind of your purview of study. You and I were talking there just a minute ago about how environmental conservation is for everyone. It's for the people.
It's for the people, and a broad range of people have been involved in ensuring that we do have wild places and wilderness in these conserved and preserved places. The typical story that gets told in American environmental history is that, starting in the 1960s, predominantly middle-class activists, people who lived in cities but enjoyed going out to wilderness or enjoyed recreating in forests and on rivers, they started to organize, and they put pressure on Congress and they put pressure on political leaders to create more forest protections and more landscape protections. And one of the big results of this or consequences of this movement was the 1964 Wilderness Act, which established a wilderness system that definitely people in Oregon and definitely myself have benefited from and enjoy, and people across the country. There are dozens of wilderness areas, in Alaska. Idaho has some of the biggest, most remote wilderness areas. So yeah, that's the typical story that gets told, that this moment of environmentalism and environmental politics was a middle class effort led by middle class activists, and that is not entirely wrong. But like so many things in history, the commonly accepted story or the commonly accepted narrative obscures as much as it leaves out. And one of the things that my research looks at is the ways in which working people, as well as organized labor, have been very adamant about conserving nature and protecting nature, and have made a lot of political efforts to conserve and protect nature. And specifically, my research focuses on loggers. I'm sure it's similar in Alaska, right? When you say logger, the first thing someone thinks of is someone who's opposed to environmentalism, someone who's opposed to conservation, right? They want to cut the trees because that is what their job depends on. But again, I would emphasize that commonly accepted narrative obscures a heck of a lot more than it reveals. And one of the things I show in the course of my research is that loggers, and specifically some of the trade unions that represented loggers, have been key in helping to enact conservation measures, as well as a broader wilderness system that we all benefit from.
Yeah, and so first of all, I saw a cat in the background. So what's the
Oh
cat's
yeah,
name?
that was Maeve. Unfortunately, if I am, this is my wife's office. If I'm in the office, Maeve insists on being in here, and she is squeaky. So I apologize for that. And
No, you're totally fine. I saw the cat in the background and I went, I've got to know who it is.
yeah,
And so I guess this is it's really fascinating, because I do think that the commonly accepted narrative will always lose a little bit of the nuance that history requires and
absolutely.
deserves,
Yeah.
right? Like it's too much to constantly ask everybody to understand so deeply in every matter. But what's really fascinating here is, you're right, we do think that loggers are the antithesis to good stewardships of the community. How did we get to this point where they've become these cartoon villains, right? Because they are
Yeah.
cartoon villains. Like,
Right.
that is what you see it in, like, the like Johnny Test and Recess School's Out. Like, there's a whole movie about how corporations hate the environment so much.
Right.
Like, so how did we get to this point?
Yeah, well, so I think we have to distinguish between a couple different categories when we're talking about the timber industry in the American West, and specifically the Pacific Northwest. Is you have workers, and then you have kind of small landowners, some of which contract with workers, some of them who log the land themselves. And then you got the big landowners in the Pacific Northwest. It's Weyerhaeuser is the big one, and historically, and things have changed today, but historically, workers, small landowners, and big companies were not aligned when it came to land use politics and land use policy. So you always got to be careful to differentiate that. And anyone who knows the history of logging will be critical that I just vastly oversimplified the economic and social categories, in that little explanation there. But for simplicity's sake, and because you don't want this interview to run 6 hours, I'll just leave it at the three categories. And really what I focus on are the kind of smaller landowners and the timber workers themselves, the wage workers in the industry. And yeah, they are the ones who have a long record of stewardship and conservation. And when I started doing this research, I'm not from the Pacific Northwest. I'm originally from suburban Chicago, and I believed, like most people, that timber workers were the antithesis or anathema to environmentalism and conservation. I had been convinced by that broader narrative, as so many people were. But what surprised me is when I started going back and looking at the historical record, looking at archives and documents from the 1950s, middle class activists talked about loggers and the working classes if they were the greatest champions of conservation. So yeah, the question becomes, what happened? How did we get to this point where, you know, environmental organizations are celebrating loggers and loggers unions as great, important partners in their struggle for wilderness protection, to a point where most people think the opposite? And really, that happens, or that starts to change in a couple different points. Starts to happen in the 1970s when the emergence of the new left. Essentially, you got the old left, which is like the left of the trade union movements of the 1930s, the communist and socialist parties. They're kind of overtaken by like the anti-war movement and civil rights movement, more younger people. And these younger people.
Would that be the neoliberal movement of the later Jimmy Carters, the Bill Clintons?
Neoliberal movement, little something different. Like New Left is oftentimes reacting to kind of neoliberal politics, but neoliberalism is emerging somewhat at the same time as the New Left. You get these kind of new developments on both the left and the right. So yeah, the New Left, again, very progressive folks, but also younger folks who didn't have the same relationship with organized labor, so they see them as more kind of part of the old establishment. So that's one of the big changes that happens. And it's folks from that new left that are going to go on to be really crucial in environmental politics and environmentalism of the later 20th century. So that's part of the reason. But really, the big reason why we have this more popular cultural perception that loggers are opposed to environmentalism has to do with the spotted owl conflict, which was this really divisive conflict that begins in the late 1970s, early 1980s in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Northern California, where environmentalists really seized on this ostensibly endangered species called the northern spotted owl, and they started seeking and were successful in getting a lot of restrictions to logging and logging on public lands throughout the Pacific Northwest. And the logging industry in the Pacific Northwest is a fraction of what it once was. A lot fewer logs are harvested today than were 40, 50 years ago. And the demise of the industry and the decline of the industry has caused a lot of social and economic problems in rural timber working communities. But one of the big reasons why, not the only reason, but one of the big reasons why there was this decline in logging had to do with these new environmental protections pushed for by these environmental activists. Environmental activists, oh, sorry, that was my email, close that. So these working class loggers, timber workers, they were very opposed to spotted owl protections. And that's how they kind of got this reputation in, popular culture among kind of leftist activists of being opposed to environmentalism. But what I argue in a lot of my work is that yes, they were opposed to spotted owl protections specifically, but their actual position on conservation and the environment was a heck of a lot more nuanced. What they didn't want was just these kind of blanket policies that tried to essentially mandates harvest reductions and restrictions throughout the Northwest. What they said is, let's set aside some areas for spotted owls, let's set aside some for logging. They wanted a more multi-use, nuanced forest policy, and that kind of got lost. So the reason that narrative exists that you asked about, of like, why do so many people believe loggers are anti-environmentalists, really comes out of the spotted owl conflict and the stories that got told in that era.
Interesting. And I mean, so we are seeing similar movements now, or at least we saw similar movements at the time, right? I believe later the Marine Mammals Protection Act kind of comes about. So there are these kind of moments where, in order to preserve a species, Congress is taking blanket actions to protect things, and thus negatively impacting the economic area when the local people have a much better idea of what's going on.
Absolutely, and that's what I'm a big advocate for in a lot of my work, especially work on the timber industries. Right, is that these local, rural, working class timber working communities, they deeply care about the forest that surrounds their homes. Right, it's the place they work. Right, their livelihood is dependent on timber, not just now but in the future. But one of the things that has struck me in my research, and actually one of the ways I got into the course of this research, is I fish and hunt. And so if you fish and hunt in Oregon, you end up talking to a lot of timber workers. I was constantly meeting these loggers, or retired loggers, when I was out fishing or out hunting, and they talked about the land and the forests with this deep reverence and this deep care. So these folks, they not only care about these forests because it's their livelihood, they care about these forests because, they recreate in those forests just like the middle class folks. These places are special to them. They appreciate the beauty of these places. And so they want them to be there. And at the same time, they recognize that, they need logs for their local economies, and the nation needs logs for our broader national and global economy. And so what they've always, looked to do is figure out, how do we balance sustainable timber harvests with conservation and preservation? And what I argue in a lot of my work is that local people who are living in the woods, near the woods, working in the woods, recreating in the woods, they don't have all the answers. No one does. But we really, really have to listen to them, because they are constantly thinking about, how do we balance these two things? Proper use of the forests as well as protection of the forest. And yeah, sometimes having a bureaucrat from a federal land agency who's never even been to the Northwest issue a decision, that negates a lot of local knowledge that can be really, really useful and really important and really instructive in how we go about managing our forests, and or any other resource, whether it's fisheries or, like you said, marine mammals or what have you.
Yeah, and one thing I think, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong here, but during the turn of that century, from the 20s, 30s, 40s, where we had that big union uptick, unions can help protect forests. They can help protect things. So being in a union is a beneficial thing, because they can put in rules and say, hey, we don't want to hurt the spotted owl or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, one of the, I wear many hats as a historian. I'm a historian of the Pacific Northwest. I'm an environmental historian and a labor historian. And one of the big projects of labor history over the past, couple of decades has been to show that a lot of really important social movements emerge out of the labor movement. So several scholars have shown how the civil rights movement has some of its origins in the labor movement, or how the women's movement has some of its origins in the labor movement. One of the things that I do, and I'd like to contribute to this conversation, is showing that, the environmental movement has some of its origins in the labor movement. And you're absolutely right, is that, workers who are organized, that brings a lot of power. So they can do things like, put in their contracts. And this is what the major timber workers union I study is the International Woodworkers of America, the IWA. They were one of the prominent timber workers unions nationally, but especially here in the Pacific Northwest. And they were a very radical union. They were a very militant union. And yes, that was one of the things they insisted on, is kind of harvest reductions and harvest restrictions in their contracts. But also the big role they played in a lot of conservation politics was essentially mobilizing their members and then using that mobilization to put pressure on politicians and say, we want laws, we want policies that are going to protect the forests. So they, over the course of they're organized in 1937. From 1937 and throughout the 20th century, they routinely, at very crucial junctures, mobilize their membership in order to pressure politicians to expand forest protections, expand or create new rules limiting essentially some of the more destructive practices that employers can engage in. So absolutely right is that the power of a union is useful for securing economic security, but as so many labor historians have shown, the power of a union is important for securing racial justice and gender equity, and as I try and show in my work, also conservation policy.
Yeah, and so what happened to these timber unions? How did they start getting? Because we are in all-time labor union
Yeah,
shortages. We
yeah,
are. It's one of the lowest in American history. At a time where wealth inequality is skyrocketing, and it feels like it's kind of hopeless. But really, you could join a union, maybe.
yeah.
So what happened to our timber unions?
Sure. So the story of timber unions and I should say that the IWA still exists. It's much smaller than it once was. It actually merged with the International Association of Machinists. So if anyone out there listening Googles it, you'll find it listed as IWA-IAM. But anyway, the story of timber workers unions in the Pacific Northwest is in many ways the story of American labor writ large, which is to say, a lot of these social, political, and economic factors that undid the labor movement across America are the things that undid the labor movement in the Northwest. So one of the big things was, starting in the 1970s, a lot of timber companies realized that they can relocate to the American South because the growth dynamics of trees in the American South are such that they could actually harvest more frequently, more often. And the other big advantage from an employer's perspective is that for reasons having to do with race and racism, the American South is a largely union-free workplace. So in the 1970s, a lot of the big timber companies, they pick up stakes, they close down their operations in the Pacific Northwest, and they relocate to the American South. And so the timber workers unions, they were kind of left high and dry because the sawmills and the logging operations where they represented workers, those workers are just getting laid off, and the South is essentially blockaded off from organized labor. So that's one reason. Smaller companies that stay in the Pacific Northwest, nevertheless, are dealing with reduced harvest rates as a result of new environmental regulations, as well as competition from British Columbia, other kind of global timber suppliers. So there's a lot of layoffs going on there. Then, there's a lot of new laws enacted in the 70s and into the 80s, especially during the Reagan administration, which really curtails the power of organized labor, their ability to strike, their ability to win strikes, their ability to organize new workers. So that's the other big thing. So it's a combination of, economic pressures and political pressures. And then, something else a lot of scholars have shown is that especially among younger workers and younger activists, unions, and we're talking kind of 1980s, 1990s. I think things are maybe starting to shift now, but among younger people in the late 20th century, unions just seemed old and stodgy and not the way forward for progressive politics. So there's kind of there's all these pressures acting upon unions, but also internally among the American working class, there's some kind of less enthusiasm for unions than there had been obviously in the 1930s or decades before. So it's kind of a death of a thousand cuts. Things may be changing now. The IWA, like I said, their membership declines steadily from the 1980s onwards. It got so low in the mid-1980s that's why they merged with the International Association of Machinists. And the IWA hadn't led a strike in maybe 20 years, but 2 years ago, I believe it was 2 years ago, they actually led a strike at a Weyerhaeuser sawmill. So I think it's too early to say the IWA or any timber workers union is resurgent. But we are seeing a lot more labor activism nationally, and so maybe that will have an impact on the woods in the Northwest. Well, yet to be seen.
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting because this all also comes at a time in which, how closely have you been following the roadless rule stuff?
Oh, that's something I'm always paying attention to. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, what can we talk about that a little bit? A little bit of what its potential impacts are to our timber workers, and historically, what effect did that have on our timber workers?
Yeah. So you're talking about kind of like roadless area reviews and yeah, roadless kind of essentially.
Yeah, the roadless rule. It was put in by, I believe, Clinton back in 2000s or
Yeah. I mean,
90s.
there's been a couple different iterations, and roadlessness is one of the kind of big goals, or preserving roadless areas is one of the kind of big goals historically of the environmentalist movement, right? And that's actually one of the things, if you want to seek a new wilderness designation, a roadless area is a better candidate for a wilderness designation than an area with roads in. So yeah, so since the 1950s, roads have been the central, way that timber's been transported from,
Coast to coast, yeah.
yeah, from, well, not just from coast to coast, but once you cut the trees, you still got to get them to the mill, and so getting them out on roads via logging trucks is kind of the prime way it's happened since the 1950s. Anyone who has driven on a Pacific Northwest logging road has had the terrifying experience of, you look up in your rearview mirror, nothing's there, and then all of a sudden there's a big logging truck going really fast, bearing down on you, because those guys are paid by the trip. So they drive fast, and they drive extremely well. They are brave.
And if you've seen the Final Destination movies, you don't get behind them.
No, hey, when I see a logging truck, I pull over and I let them go. In their face. That is my policy towards logging trucks. But
it's a good one.
Yeah. So right. So there have been attempts to stop road building or prevent road building where none exists. And again, I think from a timber worker's perspective, at least timber workers I've discussed similar issues or this issue with. It's we can't have a blanket policy, right? We can't say no new roads anywhere, and we can't say roads everywhere, right? Is that certain areas are maybe good candidates for more roads to allow access to logging, depending on the forest dynamics, depending on the history of the forest there. Other areas, some loggers would say, like, hey, that's like an old growth forest, or it's a ecologically special place that doesn't have a road. Let's keep that a special ecological place and not log that with roads. So yeah, again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is that any blanket policy that tries to institute a rule or regulation that applies to all Pacific Northwest forests is going to create a lot of political acrimony, and at the same time, it is not always going to be the most effective thing. So that's kind of my understanding, or what I'd argue about kind of roadless rules and roadless areas is, some in some places are really good, and some in some places maybe not such a good idea.
Yeah, it all depends on how you implement it, and the way you get help implementing it is you have unions and people on the ground who can help guide those policies.
Well, and that's one of the big problems of that certainly started to emerge in the Spotted Owl era, because one of the things that preceded the Spotted Owl conflict was the dramatic decline of organized labor, and what that meant is that when there's this all of a sudden this conflict now between environmentalists and the Forest Service and private landowners and logging companies that log on public lands, workers really didn't have a seat at the table because they didn't have any institutional representation, right? They're going up against an environmental movement which had grown exponentially in the 80s and 90s with a lot of money from a lot of donations. So they're going up against one very economically powerful interest, and then you got the timber companies, another economically powerful interest, and then you got the Forest Service, which is a large government bureaucracy. You had all these really, really powerful forces. And even though timber workers are a really important constituency here, they don't get a seat at the table because there's just no institutional representation. So that is, I think, also one of the problems why the Spotted Owl conflict became so acrimonious, so vitriolic, and ultimately why all these other groups were able to shape the narrative about timber workers, is because essentially what happened, the only thing they could do was try and organize amongst themselves and stand outside some of these public hearings and protest. And yeah, they couldn't actually reasonably engage in a conversation just because they didn't have a political force to represent them.
And so, having a union in that situation, we would have a much different story.
Oh, absolutely. I think if unions had not gone into decline in the 70s and early 80s, the story of the Spotted Owl conflict and the story of environmental conflict, at least here in the Pacific Northwest, would look very different. I'd like to think it would have been there'd be a little bit less yelling and a lot more cooperation. That might be a naive view, but I also think that that holds up, is when we can make sure that all interested parties are represented and are on equal footing when it comes to kind of the power dynamics. Those conversations tend to be a lot more productive because everyone's voice is being heard. And again, I don't want to say it's a perfect system, right? There's no such thing as a perfect system, especially when it comes to environmental politics and land management. But definitely, timber workers would not have had to resort to, like I say, organizing these angry rallies because of their frustration that their voices weren't being heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're entering a pretty work. I'm expecting to see union membership go up. Is my expectation.
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful. I hope I'm wrong about this. And again, this is one of the things labor activists and labor historians debate. But my concern is that what led to the dramatic growth of organized labor in the mid 20th century, from the 1930s through the 1960s, was we had a really strong National Labor Relations Board. We had really strong laws protecting workers who were trying to organize unions. Once workers had organized unions, we had very strong laws that required employers to bargain in good faith with those unions. The problem is, over the course, from the 1970s up to the present, those policies and laws have been attacked by politicians on both sides of the aisles. And they've been so dismantled that workers who want to organize a union now face so many more challenges than did previous generations of workers. So I hope I'm wrong. I hope again, and one of the things about historians, we're great at telling you about the past. We got really fuzzy crystal balls. So I've made plenty of predictions that are wrong. So this is one I really hope I'm wrong about. But my worry and my concern is that, unless we see a political sea change and a dramatic change in course in American labor law, the deck is stacked against workers who want to organize unions. So that's my worry.
It's certainly. I mean, especially in this time, it is worrying. But I'd like to think that we're going to start seeing a resurgence of people who want people to help protect them from the government.
And I'll say this to me is an extremely hopeful sign. Well, first off, on my campus at University of Oregon, so staff are organized in the union, graduate students are organized in the union, and faculty are organized in the union. So I'm a current union member. Student workers, students who work in the dining halls, who work as research assistants, mostly undergrads, they didn't have a union. And just last year, they had to go on strike to get their first contract, but they successfully organized a union, UO student workers. So the fact that young people, I think, are looking to organize labor and looking to unions is really hopeful to me. And another thing that's hopeful to me, so I'm a labor historian. I've always been a very proud labor historian. I had never, ever thought to offer a class in labor history because, a couple of years ago, students see labor history, they're like, that's boring, I'm not going to take it. Now, I work the history of labor into all my classes, but I never actually taught a proper labor history class. But I had enough students now express an interest in labor history that for the first time last year, I I offered a course titled American Labor History, and it filled up almost overnight. So that gives me incredible hope that I think young people who are now entering the workforce, who are going to be the ones responsible for organizing unions, are taking more of an interest in unions and seeing them as a potential solution to the dramatic social and economic inequalities that we're seeing in America in 2025. So I said like all those things that why I'm pessimistic, but there are reasons I'm optimistic, and it's kind of some of my students are one of the reasons why.
Just like history, it is extremely nuanced. Everything is nuanced, which we all hate to have, but
Yeah.
it
Well,
is the time.
yeah, I always say that historians love complexity. That some of my favorite books are the books that illustrate the complexity of a historical topic. So I always say historians are the only people for whom to complicate is a compliment, right? So when I tell another colleague of mine, "Oh, you really complicated that," that's actually a compliment. Whereas most people say, like, "You complicated it. Why is that a good thing?" But yeah, for us historians, complication is good. So yeah, because everything's nuanced, everything's complicated. Every story has a million moving parts to it.
Yep. It's no different in journalism. I'll tell you what.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, yeah, that's the other thing I say is whenever I hear that saying, there's two sides to every story. I'm like, I wish there were only two sides to every story. That would make my job a lot easier. There's usually 30 sides to every story. Same way with journalism, right?
Yep. There's always another. Every rabbit hole leads into another rabbit hole.
Indeed.
And so, I feel like have we pretty well covered the spotted owl debacle?
Well, there are books upon books upon books about the spotted owl debacle. Again, if your listeners want to sit here and listen to me for another 15 hours, we could really get into it. But we definitely got the broad brushstrokes, certainly.
I think we'll have you back on the program and we'll talk more labor and environmental history. How's that sound?
That sounds great.
And if more people want to listen to you for 15 hours, where could they do that?
I don't know if they could listen to me for 15 hours, but if you want to maybe read some of my writing, I don't know how long it would take you. I am author of Strong Winds and Widowmakers, Workers, Nature, and Environmental Conflict, or Environmental Conflict in Pacific Northwest Timber Country, published by University of Illinois Press in 2023. That covers some of the spotted owl conflict and covers some of the history of the IWA and their conservation efforts. So that might be a good place if readers or if listeners want to know more about my work. That'd be maybe a good place to start.
Would you be able to send me a link to that so that I could put it in the description?
Yeah, I absolutely will.
That would be amazing. And then any other plugs of any other work that you find inspiring that the audience may like?
Oh, I mean, there's so many great books. If you want to understand the spotted owl conflict and what happens, I actually think the best book on the topic, better than my own, which no academic likes to admit that, is a book by a journalist named William Dietrich, and it's called The Final Forest. That is just a truly, truly exceptional book. It's one of those books where, I always have students read it, and students who are environmentalists think it's pro-environmentalist. Students who come from rural timber working communities think it's pro-worker. So it's one of those just beautiful, marvelous books that takes this really intricate, very, like I said, acrimonious conflict and really makes an effort to understand it from all sides. So that's a wonderful book on the topic, one I'd highly recommend. Also, if you want to understand the history of the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest, another one of my favorite writers, historians, is William Robbins. He's a former professor at Oregon State University, since retired, but he has just many exceptional books about logging in Oregon and the Northwest. So he's another kind of person I would highly recommend. But yeah, I could sit here for another 15 hours and just list off books. That's what we historians do, is we're professional readers, more or less.
It's true. Same for journalists, but for government documents.
Hey, I read a lot of those too. So.
We love government documents. I hope they continue to exist.
Right, yeah.
Steven, thank you so much for being here. I will have you back on the show. Thank you so much for being here. I've had a great time.
Thank you for having me. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for listening. This program is made possible by our lovely guests and the patronage of viewers like you. If you enjoyed the program you're listening to, share us with a friend to help them remember a story your city forgot. And of course, another way to help the program is to give us a review on the streaming platform you're listening on. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to brush your teeth. Alright, good. We all set?